This is chapter 5 for CRJ 101, Introduction to Criminal Justice. In chapter 5, we're going to learn a little bit about the background of police, where policing came from, how it started, not only in this country, but really in the world, how it started. And then we will get into particularly information about what police agencies do and what those agencies are. In this country, our policing comes from English roots because we, as a country, come from England. Our colonies came from England. Naturally, we brought the policing system that was in England at the time to our country. And in England itself, policing started to take form in the 12th century, called the tithing system. And this was a system where 10 families were chosen under the king to keep peace in the areas where those families lived. It was very rough, not organized system, but it was really one of the first ones where we started seeing at least some authority being given to some people to maintain peace throughout society. And it started in England with these teething systems. From there, we learned about constables. And England developed these constables. And they were citizens who patrolled cities at night, and they would answer cries for help. Sometimes they were magistrates as well. And they would really, for lack of a better term, they would patrol the streets in England. And as more time went on, England began to advance its policing. And one of the first ones that we see are the Bow Street Runners. And this was run by Henry Fielding. And that's a nice name to know for testing purposes. And Henry Fielding ran this organization called the Bow Street Runners. And they operated out of Bow Street in London. And they would apprehend criminals in London. And they called them the Bow Street Runners because they would, not only were they located on Bow Street, but they would also walk them down Bow Street when they apprehended the criminals. And this really kind of paved a way for a more formalized police force in London. So this brings us to our video question number 1. As you know from the email that I sent, that not a lot of students were watching these videos. And I really don't know how else to get the message across that you need to watch these videos. They contain information you're going to be tested on, information that I think is important. And if I think it's important, you should think it's important. And they're provided also to clear up material that may be particularly complex. Not all of it, but just information that I think is important. And I found that unfortunately, not a lot of students were watching these videos. It was abundantly clear from some of the homework assignments that were sent in that students were not watching these videos. So the best way I can think of to make sure that you watch these videos for your own good, to ensure you get the best grade possible, is to ask these questions on the video. And when you look at the homework assignment for the chapter, for example, the homework assignment for this for chapter 5, you will see question number 2 says video question number 1. And that is where you would put the answer to this question that I am about to ask. So on question number 2 on the chapter 5 homework assignment 2, there's 2 assignments for chapter 5. And this is assignment number 2. And question number 2 says video question 1. And that question that you are to answer is, what do some people think COP stands for? We all heard the term, we don't really call police officers many times. We call them cops. And some people think that term cop comes from constable on patrol, coming from England, where we just learned about constables would patrol the streets at night. So there is a theory out there, and some people believe that COP stands for constable on patrol. So that is the answer to question number 2 on chapter 5 homework assignment number 2, is constable on patrol is the answer. So let's move on. We're still in London, and finally London formalized their police department, and they formed the London Metropolitan Police. And the Industrial Revolution really caused a swell in population in London. It actually caused a swell in population everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean cities. So cities were really affected by the Industrial Revolution, and they became very populated. And along with an increase in population comes crime, comes problems with increased population. It's just a natural thing to happen when there's an increase in population. So because of this swell in population in London, they decided to form the London Metropolitan Police. However, in England at the time, they feared having a central police force. But after crime was continually increasing, finally they gave way and they agreed to form a formalized police force in 1829 called the London Metropolitan Police. So that was the first officially formalized police force in London. Let's go to America now. And we mirrored what England was doing because that's what we knew, because we came from England. We also had constables. And much like England, the Industrial Revolution created a need for formal police departments. And in this country, the first paid police force in the United States was in 1844, and it was the New York City Police Department. And that's a great date to know and information to know for testing purposes, that the first paid police force in the United States was New York City Police in 1844. And now we're up to video question number 2, which is question number 6 on your chapter 5 assignment 2 homework. And the question that you're going to answer is this: is at the bottom of page 140 in your book, is a photograph of the Newport Police Department. And that is where I was a police officer for 30 years and retired as a captain, was the Newport Police Department. So to answer question number 6, you would simply put the Newport Police Department, where Professor Callow retired as a captain after 30 years of service. Again, the answer for question 6, where it says video test question number 2, is the Newport Police Department, where Professor Callow retired as a captain after 30 years of service. In the late 1800s, police departments and police officers were very corrupt and driven by political agendas. You think the police departments today are corrupt? It's nothing compared to what it was like in the 1800s, where nearly to a man, and I say to a man because there weren't women police officers at the time, to a man, it was corrupt, extremely corrupt. And then along comes August Vollmer in the early 1900s. And he's also a good man to know. Not only is your chapter 5 homework assignment 1 about August Vollmer, but you'll probably see a test question about August Vollmer. And in the early 1900s, he wanted to modernize or professionalize police work. He wanted to make it a career. He wanted it to not be corrupt and not to be driven by political agendas. And so he's known as the father of modern policing. That's a great fact to know. And part of his plan was to make police work a profession, not just a job, but a profession. And he worked on what's called the professional model. And by doing that, he created standards for hiring police. He was trying to get rid of, you got the job because of who you knew or because of political ties. He was trying to make it professional, and he created standards that in order to become a police officer on this police department, here are the standards you need to meet in order to be hired. He strongly encouraged the hiring of college graduates. So he really was a visionary. He was the first one that thought of making policing a profession, and to have college graduates, and to have standards for hiring police, to get rid of the arbitrary hiring that can lead to all sorts of problems. Not only the arbitrary hiring, but also of nepotism. And nepotism is it's who you know. And hiring either arbitrarily or through nepotism creates weak police departments. And when you have standards and you hire truly the best candidates, then that makes a stronger, better police department that is less corrupt or not as easily corruptible. And in the United States, we developed what is called community policing. And community policing is the idea that instead of police responding to the same problem over and over and over, let's solve the problem. And that's what was happening really, was police were responding to the same problem over and over. And finally, someone came up with the idea of, if the police are going to keep responding to the same problem, it's beneficial to the police to help solve that problem. And it's also beneficial with the community or for the community. So instead of just enforcing the law, police work with the community to solve problems. That's what community policing is all about. It's a partnership between the community and the police department. It got police out of their cars and into the neighborhoods. So instead of just patrolling an area, under community policing, officers are encouraged to park their cars, get out, walk their neighborhoods, get to know the people, get to know the neighborhood, the indigenous problems that come along with each neighborhood, and the people who live in the neighborhood. Because let's face it, if an officer is familiar with the people on his or her beat, then there's a greater chance that if something goes wrong in that neighborhood, if a crime is committed, that the police are going to be able to solve it much easier. They'll be informed sooner. They'll get information, a lot more information, because there's a relationship there now. It's not just an officer driving around the block who people don't know. So community policing is a contemporary approach to policing that actively involves community in a working partnership to control and reduce crime. So what are some of the advantages? I just spoke of that. Some of the advantages are because there's a better relationship, crime is reduced. When crime happens, it's solved faster and easier because of the information flow that's going back and forth between the community and policing. So let's take a look at some of the police agencies in this country. So I'll go left to right. I have city in Newport. Again, that's where I was a police officer. But by that, I mean local police. And then we have state police. Then we have federal agencies. And then private security. So there's over 18,000 police agencies in the United States. That's a lot of agencies. The vast majority of those 18,000 police agencies are local police departments, like Fall River, New Bedford, Newport. But there are other agencies. So there's local, state, federal, and private agencies that we will look at, and we will see what the differences are. As you can imagine, with that many agencies and that many types of agencies, local, state, federal, and private, that there's going to be some issues. And probably the biggest issue is jurisdiction. If a crime is committed in Fall River, both the Fall River Police and the state police has jurisdiction. So who takes that crime? Whose responsibility is it? Most of the time it will be the local police department, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And many times local and state agencies or state agencies and federal agencies, they don't play well together. Sometimes there's a battle as far as who actually has jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is defined as the authority of a justice agency to take action on a matter. There's many different definitions for jurisdiction, but that's the one that we're working with right now. So when crime does overlap, who has jurisdiction? And there's really no easy answer for that, because if you got an officer on the beat and a crime happens, the last thing he or she is going to want is for a state trooper to come in and take that crime. The local officer is going to tell them to go pound sand. This is my beat. You go to the highway and you enforce highway patrol. So quite often there are issues, and sometimes, not sometimes, but quite often, there's also communication issues, that they don't communicate with each other. The assumption that because the local jurisdiction knows what's going on is not true, that the state agency necessarily knows what's going on in a certain area, and vice versa. So there's a lot of issues that come with so many different types of agencies, and the biggest one is probably jurisdiction. So first, we're going to look at federal agencies. Most of them have very specific jurisdiction on matters, and they're created by Congress. So Congress creates these agencies, and then these agencies fall under the President of the United States, under the executive branch. Congress is the legislative branch. They create these agencies, and then these agencies are run under the executive branch, under the president's branch, because under the Constitution, the executive branch has the authority to enforce laws. So when Congress creates these federal agencies, they do so with the purpose of that agency having a very narrow jurisdiction on matters. So we have the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. What do you think their jurisdiction is? Obviously, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. We have the DEA. So all these federal agencies have specific matters that they have jurisdiction on. The four we're going to look at are the U.S. Marshals, the Secret Service, the FBI, and the DEA. And we'll look at all these individually. The U.S. Marshals, they were formed in 1789. And their duties at the time included protecting and supporting the federal court system. That's why they were created. They were created, we had this federal court system. We need security for the court system. And we also need support. And by support, I mean, who's going to serve the summonses, the subpoenas, and the warrants? And that at the time were the U.S. Marshals. They have arresting powers, but just for federal crimes. And then we had the Civil War in this country. And after the Civil War, a lot of their duties pertain to keeping the peace and keeping order in the so-called Wild West. We were starting to migrate west, and there wasn't a lot of law enforcement. So it was deemed the Wild West because at times it was out of control. So we appointed the marshals to police the Wild West. Perhaps you've heard of the gunfight at the OK Corral. That is something that really happened, and that involved the marshals. The marshals were the federal agents that were involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral. So today, they still have judicial security, meaning they still have security over federal courthouses. But now they also do fugitive investigations, witness security, and federal prisoner transportation. So the marshals have specific duties, but there's a lot of them, but these are what their duties are today. You can see on the right where it says Harrison Ford is the fugitive. The Fugitive was actually a TV show many years ago, and then they made a movie, I believe it was in the 90s, called The Fugitive with Harrison Ford. Pretty good movie, and it's about somebody who is a federal prisoner who is being transported, and there was an accident during the transportation, and he escaped. And the U.S. Marshal job was to go and find him, the fugitive. So if you're interested in movies, that is one for you to watch. I believe the marshal, the actor that played the U.S. Marshal was Tommy Lee Jones. So that brings us to the Secret Service. And the Secret Service was created in 1865, and they dealt with counterfeiting and government fraud. Today, mostly the Secret Service is security for federal officials, and mostly the president. And like most federal agencies, if you're interested in going into a federal agency, one thing you have to keep in mind is you're going to move a lot. So it's not really a job if you want to settle down and raise a family in a certain area, because they move you a lot. You're a federal officer working for a federal agency, and you're subject to being moved from being stationed in Boston to being stationed in Kansas City to going to LA. So it's not really the type of career if you're interested in settling down and having a family. It's more for single people who enjoy traveling and don't mind their roots being uprooted quite often, which is the case. So we're going to watch a video now, and we're going to see exactly what a Secret Service agent will do. And that brings us to video question number 3, which is question 10 on your chapter 5, assignment 2 homework. And I want you to answer these questions. Who was the president in this video? Who tried to shoot him? And why did he want to shoot the president? So watching this video, you'll be able to answer these questions, and those are the answers you're going to put in for number 10 on your chapter 5, assignment 2. And I think my volume is down, so let me turn it up. And I'll start it over.
1981. March 30th, 1981. John Hinckley was a 25-year-old with romantic delusion.
John Hinckley was his name. Hinckley, Hinkley.
Convinced that actress Jodie Foster would be impressed if he killed the president.
So he had an obsession with the actress Jodie Foster. This was way back in 1981. She was pretty popular back then, and he had this obsession with her. And he thought in order to impress her, if he shot the president of the United States, that would impress her.
Outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., Hinckley caught up with his target.
I don't think there was a better demonstration of how that training worked than the assassination attempt against President Reagan.
So it was President Reagan who he tried to assassinate.
Judge Jerry Parr and Ray Shattuck, as soon as that first shot goes off, they grab the president and they throw him into the car.
Agent Tim McCarthy.
So I want you to look at this guy here. If you're thinking of being a Secret Service agent, this is what you need to be prepared to do. This gentleman here in the gray suit in the middle, when the shots are fired, he's a Secret Service agent. When the shots are fired, his job was to protect the president, which was right here. His job was to protect the president. So you notice what he does? He turns and he opens his body up to blade the president, to literally take a bullet for the president. And that is the job of the Secret Service. If you want to be a Secret Service agent, you need to be prepared to do what this agent did, and that's to literally take a bullet for the person who you are protecting.
Shielded Reagan with his body, taking a bullet in the process. Within moments, the limo sped away from a scene of chaos. Hinckley was buried under a mountain of Secret Service agents. Agent McCarthy, Press Secretary James Brady, and D.C. policeman Thomas Delahanty lay on the sidewalk, severely injured. All three survived, but Brady had permanent brain damage.
The old saying that, Secret Service agent will take a bullet for the president. If you look at the Reagan assassination, Tim McCarthy did do that. He was trained to do that as well, and his heroic actions demonstrate that.
Although the agents around the president reacted heroically, many mistakes had been made. The Secret Service relies on a perimeter system of protection. The outer is a preliminary check by local police. The middle has Secret Service agents searching for weapons.
And then there's the inner perimeter, and that's the final defense. It's the agents around the president.
Hinckley had penetrated 2 of the perimeters and fired at least 5 shots at point-blank range. The Secret Service had been trying for years to get metal detectors to screen for weapons. They got authorization days later. The perimeters were tightened, and the idea of an open arrival and departure ended after the attempt against President Reagan.
So that is what the Secret Service does. And again, video question number 3, the president was President Reagan, and John Hinckley Jr. tried to shoot him, and he did so because he wanted to impress the actress Jodie Foster. Let's take a look at the FBI. They are known as the generalists of federal agencies. And the reason for that is because unlike most federal agencies, the FBI investigates everything. They don't have any specific duties like the ATF or DEA. They can enforce all federal laws. They are best known, however, for white-collar crime and organized crime investigations. But they do it all. They investigate, kidnappings, bank robberies, white-collar crime and organized crime, and a whole slew of other things that they investigate. And that takes us to the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, not agency. The A does not stand for agency. Many people think it does, but it stands for administration. But it is a federal agency. And drug enforcement, so what do? Very simple, is they enforce controlled substance laws, drugs. And again, this is one of those agencies that if you're interested in being, it's definitely not a job for a family person. It's definitely a job for somebody who is going to have to travel a lot. And that's what we have for federal agencies. Now let's look at state law enforcement, state laws, state agencies. There's 2 models for state law enforcement agencies. One, they're called the state police, which is the more common one in this area of the country. The Northeast, we have state police, and they enforce all state laws. The second type, or the second model, is what they call highway patrol. And you find these out west a lot and down in the south as well. And these highway patrol, they're state agencies, state police agencies, but they're called highway patrol. I don't know if you ever heard the term CHIPS, and there's a TV show CHIPS, and that stood for California Highway Patrol. It's their version of the state police, but they call them highway patrol. Their focus is on highway traffic. However, they still have arrest powers for state laws, but their main focus is on highway patrol. So those are the 2 models, and that's something good to know for a test, of state law enforcement agencies. That brings us to private security. And what is private security? So these guys, they don't have any arrest powers given through officially through a government like federal agencies, state agencies, and local law enforcement agencies, they have no arrest powers. They're security guards, basically. But we're seeing more and more of them in Florida in gated communities. Florida has a lot of gated communities, and they hire these private security. And sometimes there's a problem because if you look at this bottom right picture, it looks like a cop, right? It's not, though. That is a private security officer. But their vehicles and their uniforms, they look like police. So that can cause confusion, and that can be a problem. So police usually don't like private security because of some of these issues that can go along with it, but they are becoming more and more common, especially in Florida in gated communities. We're starting to see it more here also in the Northeast. And also under private security, we have vigilantes. And these guys on the right that are dressed in the red berets, the red jackets, they're an organization called the Guardian Angels. And they were an organization that was formed in the 80s in New York City in the subways. And in the 80s, and it might have even been the 70s, late 70s, the subway system in New York, there was a lot of crime, a lot of violent crime. People were getting mugged, sexually assaulted, and the police just couldn't keep up. So the gentleman in the middle formed this organization called the Guardian Angels. And a vigilante is somebody who they take criminal matters into their own hands as far as solving them. And the Guardian Angels, they're supposed to be, they claim to be trained in self-defense and martial arts. Whether they are or not, who really knows? But they dress up in these red berets and wearing red, and they patrol the subways. And they step in if somebody is being assaulted or some crime is going on. Police, again, usually don't like vigilantes because usually bad can happen from it. And the police would much rather have, if you're going to be a vigilante, more in the terms of a neighborhood watch type of thing, where you don't get involved. You just pick up that phone and call the police and say, hey, this is what's going on, as opposed to getting involved. One tragic situation where somebody got involved and there was a death, and that's the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, where George Zimmerman was quote unquote a on neighborhood watch. He saw Trayvon Martin, who he thought was suspicious. He called the police. The police said, do not confront him. He confronted him. One thing led to another, and George Zimmerman shot and killed, unfortunately, the young Trayvon Martin. So that is a big reason why police don't like vigilantes. They much prefer, they love having eyes out there. Police love having eyes out there. They just don't want you to get involved. They want you to call them if you see something, but not to get involved. And that brings us to our local law enforcement agencies, which again is the most common type of agencies, enforcement agency that we have. So 69% of all law enforcement agencies are local police department. The vast majority of them, believe it or not, have less than 50 police officers. In fact, if a police department has more than 50 police officers, it's considered a large police department. Now, the largest police department is New York City, where they have well over 30,000 police officers. So that is an extremely large police department, and that is rare. Most police departments have less than 50 police officers. And the local police, like most law enforcement agencies, are paramilitary organizations. And if anybody was ever in the military, you'll understand this. By paramilitary, we mean it's kind of like a military organization. And military organizations have strict rules and are very structured. And that's true when it comes to local, or actually any law enforcement agencies. They are considered paramilitary organizations. And, and that is because of the strict rules and the structure. Most police departments today have have a have a have rules and policies and procedures. When I got on my police department, I was handed 3 large binders of our rules and regulations. Now, when officers get on, we hand them, a disc with all the policies on it, or they're on the local drive of the police department. So it's not paper anymore. But the rules and regulations are pretty, they're pretty thorough, and they guide just about everything police officers do. And those rules are pretty strict, and so is the structure of a police department. And a typical structure of a police department looks something like this, where there'll be a chief who is the one in charge. And then underneath the chief, you have captains. And each captain is responsible for a different division of the police department. And a typical police department is broken into 3 divisions: patrol division, the CID division, which is detectives. CID stands for Criminal Investigation Division. In short, it's detectives. And then we have the services division. And services in the police department are the non-sworn police officers that work in the police department, like dispatchers and records clerks. And it also oversees, services also oversees the maintenance of the police department. So this is a typical structure for a local police department, broken down into 3 divisions. So services, you see there's a services captain. Under that captain is a lieutenant. Under that lieutenant is a sergeant. And then under the sergeant, there are officers that do work in services and civilian employees. And in police work, we have what's called a chain of command. And the chain of command means that if you have an issue or a question, or you need something from the administration, you don't go directly to the chief of police. You have to follow your chain of command. So this officer would have to go to the sergeant first with any issues. And chain of command is very important in military and in police work. The chain of command must be followed. Under CID captain, there's a lieutenant, a sergeant, and then detectives. And patrol is usually the biggest division in a police department. That's sort of the engine room of a police department. It's the biggest division, has the most personnel, and certainly the most officers. And usually it's broken down into 3 shifts. Sometimes there's a 4th shift called a swing shift. But most have just 3 shifts, sometimes called A shift, B shift, C shift, sometimes shift 1, shift 2, shift 3. They call the shifts differently. And there's a lieutenant that runs the shift, and then a sergeant under there, and then the officers on that shift. And for each shift, there's a lieutenant. So if there is an issue in the patrol division, ultimately it's up to the patrol captain to handle that issue. And that issue is brought to him through the chain of command moving up. So an officer can't just go right to the patrol captain, or an officer can't go right to the chief of police. The officer must bring whatever issue it is up through the chain of command. And that is usually by a rule or regulation. Now, the reverse is also true, that although there may not be a rule or regulation against it, it is discouraged for someone higher up to skip the chain going down. In other words, it would be inappropriate for the patrol captain to address an officer about an issue. Normally what would happen is the patrol captain would let the shift lieutenant know, who would let the sergeant know, who would then speak with the officer. That doesn't always happen, but that is usually how it's preferred for communication to take place in a police department. So that's it for Chapter 5. Please answer those video questions. I think I made it pretty clear on what the questions and the answers were. If you have any questions on any of this material, please don't hesitate to contact me. And we will see you for Chapter 6.